opening up the center and preparing for rapid piece development, a classic start to seize initiative. Challenging white's central aspirations, black immediately stakes a claim on a key diagonal and opens lines for rapid development. Initiating rapid central development, nf3 immediately targets the d4 square and prepares kingside castling, setting a dynamic tone. Opening the path for the bishop, this solidifies the pawn center and prepares for a robust Sicilian defense structure. Challenging the center immediately, this opens lines for piece development and creates dynamic possibilities. Unlocking the center, this capture immediately forces white to consider recapturing, potentially opening lines for rapid development and creating dynamic imbalances. Opening the central file swiftly establishes central presence and prepares piece development for aggressive central control. Developing the knight to f6 pressures the central pawn and prepares castling, a natural step in the Sicilian defense. Commanding the center with a knight, preparing for pawn advances and knight repositioning to control key diagonals. Preparing for solid pawn structure, this prepares to develop the bishop and support the center. Unleashing the g-pawn so early dramatically alters the pawn structure, immediately challenging black's kingside control and creating ambitious attacking chances, though it potentially weakens white's own king safety and demands precise follow-up to justify the territorial aggression. Developing the knight to its natural outpost on c6 reinforces the center and prepares to challenge white's aggressive pawn storm on the kingside. Pushing the g-pawn again aggressively carves out more kingside space, threatening to dislodge black's knight and potentially create attacking chances on the h-file, though it does weaken white's own pawn structure slightly. This knight's journey to d7, while seeming passive, is a subtle repositioning, seeking to untangle the congested queenside and prepare for a potential e5 thrust, challenging white's aggressive pawn storm head-on. It also defensively shores up the c5 square and eyes potential lines of attack should white overextend. Sharpening the attack, this knight probes aggressively, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially land on the crucial c7 square, a classic Sicilian theme where central control is sacrificed for dynamic piece play. A bold retreat, aiming to reinforce the queenside and create a more solid pawn structure, though it relinquishes some central influence and allows white's knight to potentially probe further. Sensing an opportunity, white aims to exploit the potential weakness on the queenside and disrupt black's piece coordination by targeting the ever-so-important light squares, while simultaneously preparing for a potential kingside pawn storm or piece maneuvering. Asserting presence on the light squares, this knight's leap seeks to disrupt white's aggressive pawn storm by creating an outpost and eyeing potential weaknesses, subtly shifting the game's focus from the kingside attack to a more central struggle and hinting at a future queenside counterplay. Unleashing a swift queen sortie, white immediately intensifies pressure along the h5-e8 diagonal, aiming to exploit black's slightly underdeveloped queenside and the misplaced knight on b6, while simultaneously creating latent threats against the black king's safety. The knight retreats, seeking sanctuary on a less exposed square, sacrificing immediate pawn advances for a more stable structure. This reassures black's king, now shielded by this repositioned knight, while white's aggressive pawn storm on the kingside seems to have lost some of its initial impetus. Focusing on the underdeveloped queenside, this development aims to bolster the bishop's influence on the long diagonal and prepare for potential operations on the c-file, while simultaneously safeguarding the king. This aggressive thrust aims to dislodge the knight, creating a spatial advantage on the queenside and potentially opening lines for the rook. Unleashing the knight towards the queenside aims to disrupt black's defensive setup and create overextended pawn structures. However, consider if this forward surge creates more weaknesses than it exploits, potentially leaving the knight a tempting target for black's developing pieces and questioning the long-term safety of white's own king. The knight's retreat to e5 shores up the d7 pawn and offers a strategic retreat, preparing to contest the center and potentially reroute to a more active square. This maneuver cleverly sidesteps the immediate threat of the white queen and bishop, opting for defensive solidity over aggressive counterplay. The knight now has eyes on the central d3 and f3 squares, and importantly, it frees up the f6 knight to rejoin the defensive effort if needed. While not a flashy move, it's a prudent regrouping that allows black to consolidate their position and await white's next ambitious thrust. Repositioning the rook to the d-file injects immediate pressure, seeking to exploit the potential weaknesses created by black's slightly passive piece placement. This is not just about controlling a central artery. It's a subtle assertion of presence, threatening to create imbalances along that rank and potentially disrupt black's developing harmony before it truly solidifies. Consider how this rook's new home might serve as a launchpad for future operations, perhaps in conjunction with other pieces, aiming for a decisive breakthrough or a tightening positional vice. Unpinning the knight and creating a defensive pawn shield for the monarch are the immediate aims, but this move concedes vital space on the king side, potentially opening new avenues for white's aggressive pieces. White redeploys the queen to a more dynamic square, eyeing the queen's side and potentially preparing for a king-side advance or a shift in attacking focus, while also providing support for the knight should it decide to venture to a more central outpost later. Black solidifies their structure, indirectly preparing to challenge white's aggressive pawn advances on the king side and aiming to activate their light-squared bishop. Initiating a daring pawn storm, the white king's flank opens with a bold push, aiming to create immediate attacking chances and restrict black's nascent queenside counterplay. Unleashing a pawn storm on the king side often comes with a positional cost, and this pawn push, while seemingly aggressive, opens up lines around black's monarch that white is keenly eyeing. The long-term repercussions of weakening the kingside pawn structure for immediate aggression should be carefully weighed against the potential benefits. The bishop finds a more active diagonal, preparing to support the kingside advance and potentially eye the queenside where black's knight lurks. Sacrificing material to pry open the kingside, black initiates a sharp confrontation, daring white to prove compensation for the lost pawn by exposing their monarch. The bishop aggressively claims the open g-file, eyeing potential weaknesses around black's king. Black solidifies the kingside pawn structure, aiming to prevent further pawn advances and preparing to castle kingside soon. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, white aggressively pushes the f-pawn, aiming to pry open lines and exploit black's potentially exposed monarch. A bold maneuver that demands black's utmost attention to defensive nuances and counterplay possibilities. Black aims to alleviate the pressure building on the kingside by challenging the knight that has been harassing their structure, while simultaneously preparing to develop the bishop on c8 and potentially contest the d-file. Exchanging that bishop eliminates a key defender of black's king, now potentially exposing it to further aggression along the light squares, while simultaneously simplifying the position for white. Unleashing the queen into the center, black challenges the immediate aggressive thrust of white's bishop on e7 and seeks to untangle the queenside. This maneuver aims to improve the queen's coordination and potentially disrupt white's carefully constructed attacking formation on the kingside. Shifting the queen to the f-file now eyes the weakened kingside and prepares to support a potential g-pawn advance, creating further confinement for black's monarch. A tactical rethink emerges as black redirects the knight, seeking refuge from the exposed e7 square and preparing to potentially contest the c-file, albeit at the cost of some mobility for the moment. White repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to reinforce the central control and prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside, while simultaneously keeping an eye on the weak dark squares around black's king. Black seeks to reroute the queen, abandoning the open h-file and signaling a defensive posture as white's kingside initiative peters out. A strategic reshuffling begins, aiming to prepare a kingside pawn storm with the pawn, creating potential weaknesses around the black monarch by building an advanced pawn chain. The unleashed diagonal offers a new avenue of attack towards white's kingside, while simultaneously securing black's queen from immediate threats and preparing for a potential d5 break. Securing the queen's escape route while preparing to contest the crucial d-file, this maneuver subtly shores up white's position. White's ambition to dominate the central dark squares is still palpable, as the queen's repositioning hints at future maneuvers on the kingside, potentially involving a rook lift or a pawn push to destabilize black's defensive structure. The current queenside pawn structure is a delicate matter. This subtle redirection of the queen avoids immediate complications and allows white to assess black's intentions more clearly before committing further resources. Consider the implications for the bishop on g2. This move indirectly reinforces its defensive capabilities and preserves its attacking potential, acting as a silent guardian of white's kingside. A patient readjustment, this offers flexibility, enabling white to respond to a variety of black's developing ideas without revealing their full hand just yet. Challenging white's initiative, the knight maneuvers towards the queenside, aiming to contest the open central files and potentially offer some defensive coverage for the vulnerable kingside structure. King safety is paramount, and castling now secures the monarch behind a robust pawn shield, a crucial step given the exposed nature of black's king on the queenside. A decisive reorientation, the black queen vacates the cramped queenside, preparing to join the fray on the kingside where white's pawn thrusts have created potential weaknesses. But its placement here also allows for potential tactical skirmishes with white's advanced pieces. Exchanging queens here precipitates a strategic shift towards the endgame, where white aims to leverage his more active pieces and potential pawn majority on the queenside. A surprising simplification occurs here, trading off the queens and opening the door to an endgame where black's knight on a7 finds itself rather awkwardly placed, potentially becoming a target for white's centralizing maneuvers. Pivoting the knight to the rim isn't just repositioning. It's a deliberate bid to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially exploit weaknesses on the queenside by eyeing the pawn or preparing a future b4 push. Exploring new possibilities on the queenside, this knight repositions aggressively, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and contest the file. A bold attempt to disrupt black's carefully constructed pawn structure, potentially opening lines for white's pieces by sacrificing the knight for a pawn and initiative, but it risks leaving white's king exposed if the ensuing complications don't yield immediate, decisive pressure. Exchanges often simplify the position, but here, giving up the knight on f3 opens a pathway for the black queen, potentially revitalizing her inactive presence on the queenside and creating dynamic possibilities on the dark squares, which are currently underexploited. Resuming the initiative through the open f-file, the rook now actively seeks to participate in the unfolding complexities, potentially supporting a pawn advance or even infiltrating enemy territory. Asserting pressure on the c-file, the bishop solidifies its position, eyeing potential weaknesses in white's pawn structure while defending its own nascent threats. A surprising and aggressive commitment of white's rook, aiming to exploit the now open h-file and create immediate attacking possibilities against black's vulnerable kingside pawn structure, even if it leaves the rook somewhat exposed. Reclaiming the central outpost after the forced exchanges, black now actively contests the king's file, preparing to dislodge white's rook and potentially exploit weaknesses on the kingside. Sharpening the central grip and aiming to restrict black's queen maneuver, this move seeks to seize the initiative by preparing a pawn storm or bolstering the d4 square. The monarch's journey to safety begins, a vital step in this dynamically balanced position. Securing the monarch amidst the storm initiates a cautious endgame pivot. Black boldly challenges white's queenside space with a pawn thrust, aiming to disrupt the harmony of white's pieces and create active counterplay on the flanks. This aggressive pawn push signals a desire to open lines and potentially exploit the weakened light squares on white's kingside. Unveiling the bishop's path opens up the diagonal towards the queenside pawn structure, subtly probing for weaknesses and preparing to contest the c-file should an opportunity arise, while also bolstering the king's safety by providing an escape square. Seizing an open file is often paramount, and here black makes a decisive grab for the crucial c-file, a powerful asset in the ensuing structural imbalance. White carves open the b-file, aiming to exploit the pawn structure now fractured by black's recent capture. This aggressive pawn push immediately creates an imbalance, forcing black to consider how to defend against potential pressure along the newly opened avenue. With the queens exchanged, the focus shifts dramatically to pawn play and piece activity in the center and queenside. Black shores up the queenside by reinforcing the pawn, simultaneously preparing to activate the rook on c8 and potentially challenge the open c-file, all while the central pawn structure remains slightly compromised due to white's recent pawn capture. Unleashing a pawn spear towards e5 injects immediate dynamism into the center, creating a pawn chain that aims to restrict black's knight activity and potentially open lines for white's pieces, especially the rook on the h-file should the pawn advance further. Harnessing the open file for an assault on white's doubled pawns presents a dynamic strategy, aiming to unravel white's pawn structure and create immediate tactical opportunities along the c-file. Securing the rook's presence on the second rank, this redeployment anticipates a potential exchange and prepares to contest the now open c-file, aiming to stifle black's central pawn push while offering a defensive bastion. Securing the queenside with this rook maneuver aims to gain valuable space and potentially initiate counterplay on the open files, while simultaneously keeping a watchful eye on white's advancing kingside pawns and the potential for them to become a future threat. Unlocking the diagonal for the bishop to eye potential weaknesses around black's king offers a new layer of pressure, transforming white's previously static piece into an active participant in the unfolding battle on the queenside. The knight's journey to the queenside, aiming for c8, seeks to activate a dormant piece and potentially support a kingside pawn push later, but it leaves the kingside temporarily less defended as the white bishop on e2 now eyes the kingside diagonals. Navigating the knight to its new outpost on b3 aims to pressure black's queenside pawns, particularly the isolated c5 pawn, while also preparing to redeploy to potentially stronger squares like c5 or d4 if the opportunity arises. Bailing out from the queenside pressure, this maneuver aims to unlock the rook's activity and potentially challenge the knight's strong outpost. Initiating a crucial regrouping maneuver, the knight repositions to the more central square, aiming to exploit the open lines and support potential pawn advances on the queenside or even threaten a kingside infiltration depending on black's subsequent choices. Unleashing the bishop to e8 aims to solidify the queenside pawn structure, creating a resilient barrier against further white incursions, and preparing to potentially swing the piece over to the king's defense should the situation demand it. The advanced rook on the fourth rank begins its slow but determined march, aiming to penetrate the enemy position and exploit the cramped nature of black's defenses. The rook, having pushed past the blockade, now eyes the open files leading towards white's queenside, seeking to exploit the recent pawn structure weaknesses and create active counterplay against the exposed king. The bishop on d3 now eyes the queenside, preparing to support a potential advance of the pawn while simultaneously keeping an eye on the f5 square, a key defensive outpost for black's pieces. Awakening the rook from its slumber on the file signifies a bold attempt to disrupt white's seemingly solidified position, seeking activity where none was readily apparent. Harnessing the power of the now open file, this piece aims to pierce into black's territory, threatening to destabilize their queenside and exploit any lingering weaknesses. Initiating a desperate counterattack on the queenside, black seeks to untangle their pieces and create some activity before the inevitable invasion of white's rook. Initiating a robust counterattack on the queen's flank, the rook now secures the crucial open c-file, challenging black's recent pawn push and disrupting their plans. A decisive exchange is initiated, a calculated sacrifice of material to seize control of the crucial open file. Securing a crucial outpost for the knight on c2, a quiet positional maneuver that aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and prepare for further infiltration. Opening the *f** file with this pawn thrust creates a dynamic tension, forcing a reckoning with the king's safety on the queenside and challenging white's doubled pawns. Sacrificing the pawn opens a critical file for your rook, aiming to disrupt black's pawn chain and create new attacking avenues towards the king. The king ventures out, seeking sanctuary amongst its own pawns. A risky maneuver in this fractured position where open lines offer attacking avenues. Harnessing the open diagonals, the knight ventures forward, aiming to disrupt the pawn structure and create imbalances. Injecting new life into the knight by repositioning it to d6 opens up a world of possibilities, potentially aiming for the c4 square or even the tempting e4 outpost, while simultaneously offering support to the f6 pawn should the opportunity arise. Refocusing the bishop's attention towards the center and preparing to contest the vital d-file after the recent exchanges. A daring gambit to pierce the enemy's defensive cordon, this knight repositions itself from a passive outrunner to a potential dagger aimed at white's kingside, hinting at future queenside fireworks by leveraging the newly opened b-file. Unleashing the knight creates a powerful discovered attack, forcing the opponent's king into a precarious position and potentially opening lines for further assault. The black king, having escaped the immediate storm, now seeks sanctuary on the kingside, aiming to consolidate its position and escape the precarious open files that have developed. Initiating a campaign to blockade the enemy knight and consolidate central influence. Initiating a counterthrust into the opponent's weakened queenside pawn structure aims to disrupt white's coordinated pieces and gain central influence, potentially opening lines for the rook. Shifting the bishop to a square that bolsters the central pawn chain and prepares for a potential queenside expansion looks like a solid positional adjustment. Refocusing the bishop to support the advancement of the knight is a sound positional maneuver, aiming to shore up the pawn structure and prepare for potential operations on the kingside. Consolidating the monarch towards the queenside offers a more secure shelter, preparing to engage the rook on the open file and exert pressure on the pawn. A crucial redeployment begins as the rook shifts from the crowded queenside to the more open central file, aiming to increase pressure on white's king and potentially contest the central control. Pivoting the rook to the g-file aims to reinforce the queen's assault and prepare for potential kingside activity, creating a doubled attacking force. The black king, abandoning its shelter, surges forward, aiming to become an active participant in the unfolding battle. Sacrificing material to expose the enemy monarch often signals a shift towards aggressive intent. Accepting the exchange with the bishop solidifies white's control of the crucial open g-file, creating a dangerous passed pawn on g6 that will demand constant attention and potentially decide the game. Sweeping the rook across, white forces a decisive exchange, aiming to shatter black's pawn shield and expose the king. The black king, having bravely ventured out, now faces a critical juncture. Its safety depends on its ability to escape the rampant white king's onslaught and find a sanctuary behind its own remaining pawns, lest it becomes a prime target for further sacrifices. The king is thoroughly exposed now, and this forcing check with the rook is designed to dislodge the defending knight and open further lines of attack against the black monarch.